The lawyer's voice on the phone sounded almost apologetic when he told me I had just inherited 600 acres of prime land in northern Georgia from an uncle I had met exactly twice in my life. And my first thought was not gratitude but suspicion, because nothing in life comes that easy. I am Xavier Garrison, a 32-year-old mechanical engineer living in Atlanta, and up until that phone call on a rainy Tuesday morning in March, my biggest concern was whether my landlord would finally fix the leaking pipes in my apartment. My uncle Theodore had died at 87, and apparently, he had remembered me in his will despite the fact that our only interactions had been at 2 family reunions when I was a kid. The lawyer, a man named Richard Pemberton with a firm in Dalton, Georgia, explained that Uncle Theodore had been a bit of a recluse who had accumulated land over the decades and never developed it. The inheritance seemed straightforward enough. I would need to come up to Dalton, sign some papers, and the land would be mine. Pemberton mentioned something about property taxes and suggested I might want to sell it quickly if I could not afford the annual costs, but I barely heard him. 600 acres. Even undeveloped land in Georgia had to be worth something substantial. I took 2 days off work and drove up to Dalton the following week. Pemberton's office was in a renovated brick building downtown, the kind of place that tried too hard to look historic. He was a thin man in his 50s with wire-rimmed glasses and a nervous habit of adjusting his tie. When I sat down across from his desk, he spread out a series of documents and maps. "Your uncle was quite the character," Pemberton said, sliding a survey map toward me. "He bought this land piece by piece starting in the 1970s. It is all contiguous, sits about 15 miles outside of Dalton proper, beautiful area. Some woods, some clearings, a creek running through the eastern portion." I studied the map. The property was shaped irregularly, like someone had pieced together a jigsaw puzzle with land parcels. "Has anyone been maintaining it? Your uncle paid a local fellow to check on it periodically, keep squatters off, that sort of thing. But no real development or farming, just land." Pemberton shuffled through more papers. "Now there is one small matter we need to discuss." The way he said "small matter" immediately put me on edge. In my experience, lawyers only minimized things when they were about to tell you something significant. "What kind of matter?" Pemberton pulled out another map, this one more detailed and clearly more recent. About 8 years ago, a development company called Sunrise Properties began building a subdivision called Meadowbrook Estates on what they believed was county land available for development. They went through all the proper channels, got permits, the whole 9 yards. The county approved everything. I stared at him. On my uncle's land. Well, it gets complicated. There was apparently a clerical error decades ago in the county records. Some of your uncle's land was incorrectly listed as county-owned. The county, believing they owned it, sold development rights to Sunrise Properties. Your uncle discovered this about 6 years ago when he was reviewing his property boundaries with a surveyor. My head was spinning. "So what happened? Did he sue?" "He did better than that," Pemberton said, and I detected the faintest hint of admiration in his voice. He had ironclad documentation proving his ownership, deeds going back decades, all properly recorded in the state archives, even if the county had botched their own records. Rather than force the developers to tear down what they had already built, which would have resulted in years of litigation, your uncle negotiated a settlement. The subdivision could stay, but they would pay him rent, substantial rent. I sat back in my chair. How substantial? Pemberton smiled for the first time since I had met him. $20,000 per month, with annual increases tied to inflation. The development has 87 homes currently, with room for about 20 more. The HOA that manages Meadowbrook Estates is responsible for collecting and paying the rent. It has been structured so that each homeowner pays a portion as part of their HOA fees. $20,000 a month. I did the math quickly. $240,000 a year. For land I had just inherited, I felt like I was in some kind of fever dream. This is legal, completely binding, absolutely. Your uncle's attorneys were very thorough. I have copies of all the agreements here. The arrangement runs with the land, meaning as long as you own the property, the rent continues. The agreement lasts for 99 years from the date it was signed. I spent the next 2 hours reviewing documents. Everything Pemberton said checked out. Uncle Theodore had been meticulous. He had not only proven his ownership beyond any doubt, but had negotiated a deal that was legally bulletproof. The subdivision was effectively leasing the land from him, and now from me. "Has there been any trouble with payments?" I asked. Pemberton hesitated. "Not with the payments themselves. They have been timely. But I will be honest with you, Xavier. The HOA board is not happy about this arrangement. They have tried several times to renegotiate, to buy out the land, to find some legal loophole. Your uncle refused all their offers. They are going to know about the inheritance soon, and they will likely approach you as well." "Let them approach," I said. I was already thinking about what $240,000 a year would mean for my life. I could pay off my student loans, buy a real house, maybe even retire early if I invested wisely. As long as the agreement is solid, I am not interested in renegotiating. I signed the papers, officially becoming the owner of 600 acres and the landlord to an entire subdivision. Pemberton gave me keys to Uncle Theodore's old cabin on the property, which sat on a portion of the land away from the development. He also gave me a thick folder containing all the documentation about the HOA agreement and contact information for the current HOA board president. The drive to the property took about 20 minutes from Pemberton's office. The land was in a genuinely beautiful area, rolling hills covered in pine and hardwood forests, with the North Georgia mountains visible in the distance. I followed the GPS down increasingly rural roads until I found the unmarked turnoff that led to Uncle Theodore's cabin. The cabin was more of a small house, actually, a well-maintained ranch-style building with a broad front porch. Someone had clearly been keeping it up. The inside was clean, sparsely furnished, but comfortable. Uncle Theodore had lived simply but not without comfort. I found more files in his study, including a detailed journal about his discovery of the county's error and his subsequent negotiations with the development company. Reading through his notes, I got a sense of the man. He had been smart, patient, and not particularly interested in confrontation, but absolutely unwilling to be cheated. When he discovered that a subdivision was being built on his land, he had not immediately lawyered up and gone to war. Instead, he had gathered his documentation, confirmed beyond any doubt that he was in the right, and then approached the situation practically. The developers had already built roads, installed utilities, and constructed about 40 homes by the time he made contact. Forcing them to relocate would have been a Pyrrhic victory at best, so he had offered them a deal. They could stay, but they would pay fair market value for the lease of the land. He had hired an independent appraiser who determined that $20,000 per month was reasonable given the location and size of the development. The developers, facing potential financial ruin if they had to relocate, had agreed. They had also agreed that the HOA, once established, would take over the rent payments. I was still reading through the files when I heard a car pulling up outside. I looked through the window and saw a black Mercedes SUV parking next to my Honda. A woman got out, and even from a distance, I could tell she was on a mission. She was probably in her late 40s, with highlighted blonde hair styled in that aggressive way that seems designed to demand speaking to managers. She wore white capri pants and a pink polo shirt, and she walked up to the porch like she owned the place. I opened the door before she could knock. "Can I help you?" She looked me up and down with an expression that managed to be both suspicious and dismissive. "Are you Theodore's nephew?" "I am Xavier Garrison, and you are Barbara Whitmore. I am the president of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association." She said it like she was announcing herself as royalty. "We need to talk." I stepped aside. "Come in." Barbara walked into the cabin like she was conducting an inspection, her eyes darting around critically. I noticed she did not wait to be invited to sit before taking a seat on Uncle Theodore's couch. "I will get straight to the point," Barbara said. "This rent situation is unacceptable. It is a burden on our homeowners, and frankly, it is based on a questionable legal foundation. Now that Theodore has passed, this is an opportunity to resolve this matter fairly." I sat down in the chair across from her. "The legal foundation is not questionable at all. I have reviewed all the documentation. My uncle owned this land, the county made an error, and a settlement was reached. That settlement is binding." Barbara's smile was tight. "Theodore was a difficult man. He took advantage of an unfortunate situation to extract money from hard-working families. Surely you do not want to continue that legacy. My uncle negotiated a fair lease for his land that a development company built on without proper verification of ownership. That is not taking advantage. That is protecting his property rights. $20,000 a month is not fair. It is extortion." I felt my temper rising but kept my voice level. "Divided among 87 homes, that is about $230 per household per month. For homes that, based on the property values I looked up online, sell for between $400,000 and $600,000. That seems entirely reasonable for land lease." Barbara stood up abruptly. "You have clearly already made up your mind, but let me be clear, Mr. Garrison. The Meadowbrook Estates HOA has resources and connections. We will not continue to be victimized by this arrangement. If you choose to be unreasonable, we will explore every legal option available to us." "You are welcome to try," I said, standing as well. "The agreement is ironclad. My uncle made sure of that. Now, if you will excuse me, I have a lot to go through here." Barbara's face flushed red. "You have no idea what you are dealing with. We are a community of influential people. Lawyers, business owners, county officials. You are making a big mistake." "Is that a threat?" "It is a fact." She walked to the door, then turned back. "You will be hearing from our attorneys." After she left, I stood on the porch watching her SUV disappear down the dirt road. I probably should have felt intimidated, but mostly I felt annoyed. I had been the legal owner of this property for less than a week, and already the HOA was trying to bully me into giving up what was rightfully mine. I spent the next few days at the cabin, familiarizing myself with the property and going through more of Uncle Theodore's records. The subdivision was on the southwestern portion of the 600 acres, taking up roughly 60 acres. The rest of the land was untouched forest and clearings. I hiked through parts of it, following old trails Uncle Theodore had marked. On the third day, I decided to actually visit Meadowbrook Estates. The entrance to the subdivision was marked by an elaborate stone sign and perfectly manicured landscaping. The streets were clean and lined with uniform oak trees. The houses were nice, typical modern suburban construction with vinyl siding and two-car garages. It was the kind of neighborhood that probably had rules about what color you could paint your mailbox. I drove slowly through the streets, getting a feel for the place. I noticed several people outside doing yard work or walking dogs. A few of them stared at my car with undisguised curiosity. I supposed news traveled fast in a place like this. Near the center of the subdivision, I found a small community center. The parking lot had a sign indicating that HOA meetings were held there on the first Tuesday of each month. I made a note of that. As I was driving toward the exit, a woman flagged me down. She was younger than Barbara, probably in her 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She looked nervous. I rolled down my window. "Can I help you? Are you Theodore's nephew?" she asked quietly. "I am Xavier Garrison." She glanced around like she was worried about being seen talking to me. "I am Monica Reeves." I just wanted to say that not everyone in the neighborhood agrees with Barbara and the HOA board. Some of us think the rent is fair. Your uncle had every right to charge it. That was unexpected. Thank you for saying that. Barbara is telling everyone that you are trying to price people out of their homes, that you are going to keep raising the rent until we are forced to leave. But that is not true, is it? The agreement has a clear formula for rent increases tied to inflation. I am not planning to change anything about the arrangement my uncle set up. I just want to collect what is legally owed. Monica nodded. That is what I thought. But Barbara has a lot of people scared. She is talking about special assessments to hire lawyers, about fighting this in court for years. A lot of people cannot afford that on top of the regular HOA fees. She mentioned the HOA has lawyers and resources. She is exaggerating. We are not a wealthy community, despite what it might look like. Most people here are stretched thin with their mortgages. Barbara just wants to be seen as some kind of hero who defeated the evil landlord. Monica looked around again. I should go. I just wanted you to know that you have some support here, even if people are too scared of Barbara to say so publicly. After Monica left, I sat in my car thinking. This was getting complicated in ways I had not anticipated. It was not just about a legal agreement and rent payments. There was a whole community dynamic at play, with Barbara apparently positioning herself as the defender of the neighborhood against me. I drove back to the cabin and called Pemberton. Barbara Whitmore came to see me, I told him. She threatened legal action. Pemberton sighed. I am not surprised. She did the same thing to your uncle multiple times. She has never followed through because she knows they do not have a case. But she likes to bluster. One of the homeowners told me Barbara is talking about special assessments to fund litigation. She can try, but special assessments require a vote of the HOA membership. Based on what your uncle told me, Barbara is not as popular as she thinks she is. A lot of homeowners resent the current HOA fees and would not support making them higher for a legal battle they are likely to lose. What should I do? Nothing, Pemberton said firmly. You are in the right here. Let them make the first move. If they do file a lawsuit, we will respond appropriately. But I would bet money they will not actually do it. I took Pemberton's advice and went back to Atlanta to return to work. The rent from the HOA was paid automatically into an account Uncle Theodore had set up, which I now controlled. On the 1st of April, I received notification that $20,000 had been deposited. It felt surreal seeing that much money appear in my account. Over the next few weeks, I settled into my new reality. I kept my engineering job for now, not ready to make any drastic life changes yet, but I started paying off debt aggressively. I also hired a property management company in Dalton to keep an eye on the cabin and the land, making sure everything was maintained properly. In early May, I received a formal letter from a law firm representing the Meadowbrook Estates HOA. It was not a lawsuit, but rather a demand letter insisting that I renegotiate the lease terms. The letter claimed that the current rent was unconscionable and that they had grounds to challenge the agreement. It was signed by an attorney named Gerald Foster. I forwarded the letter to Pemberton, who called me the next day. "This is posturing," he said. Gerald Foster is a solo practitioner in Dalton who does small-time work. If the HOA had a real case, they would have hired a bigger firm. Foster knows he cannot win this, but Barbara probably hired him to write something official-sounding to scare you. So I should ignore it. I will respond on your behalf, reiterating that the agreement is valid and binding. That should end it. But it did not end it. In June, I received a notice that the HOA had filed a lawsuit in Whitfield County Superior Court, challenging the validity of the lease agreement. They were claiming that the agreement had been signed under duress, that Uncle Theodore had taken advantage of a difficult situation to extort money from the developers. This time, Pemberton was surprised. I did not think they would actually go through with it. This is going to cost them a fortune in legal fees, and they are almost certainly going to lose. Can they win? No. The facts are entirely on your side. Your uncle owned the land, the documentation is impeccable, and the lease terms were negotiated fairly. But litigation takes time and money. They are probably hoping you will agree to a settlement just to avoid the hassle. I am not settling, I said. If they want to fight, they can have one. Pemberton connected me with a litigation attorney named Sandra Chen, who specialized in property disputes. She was sharp, confident, and after reviewing all the documentation, told me exactly what I wanted to hear. "This case is a slam dunk," Sandra said during our first meeting in her Atlanta office. "The HOA's argument is meritless. Your uncle did not act under duress, and the lease terms are completely reasonable. If anything, you could probably charge more and it would still be fair market value. How long will this take? Could be anywhere from 6 months to 2 years, depending on how aggressively they pursue it and whether they appeal. But I am confident we will prevail at every stage." The lawsuit cast a shadow over the summer. I continued working and collecting the monthly rent, but I found myself thinking about Meadowbrook Estates more than I wanted to. I drove up to Dalton every few weeks to check on the cabin and the property, and each time I felt a strange mix of attachment and resentment toward the land. It had brought me financial freedom, but it had also brought me conflict I never asked for. In August, I attended my first HOA meeting. I was not a member of the HOA, obviously, but the meetings were technically open to the public. I wanted to see for myself what was happening in the community. The meeting was held in the community center, a bland rectangular building with fluorescent lighting and folding chairs. About 30 people were there, a mix of ages though skewing older. Barbara sat at a table at the front with 4 other board members, 3 women and 1 man, all of whom looked like they took their positions very seriously. When I walked in, the room went quiet. Barbara spotted me immediately, and her expression hardened. "This is a closed meeting for HOA members only," she announced. Actually, according to Georgia law, HOA meetings have to be open to all homeowners in the community, and since this is a publicly announced meeting in a community facility, it is also open to the public, I said calmly. I had looked this up beforehand. I am not here to cause trouble, I just want to observe. Barbara looked like she wanted to argue, but one of the other board members, an older man with white hair, leaned over and whispered something to her. She pressed her lips together in a thin line. "Fine. But you do not have speaking privileges." "Understood." I took a seat in the back. The meeting started with standard business, approving minutes from the last meeting, discussing landscaping contracts, debating whether to install speed bumps on one of the streets. It was all incredibly mundane. Then Barbara got to what she called ongoing legal matters. As most of you know, We are currently engaged in litigation to challenge the unconscionable lease agreement that has been imposed on our community," Barbara said, her voice taking on a dramatic tone. "This agreement costs each household over $200 per month, money that could be going toward improving our community or staying in your pockets. The board has hired excellent legal representation, and we are confident that we will prevail." A woman in the front row raised her hand. "How much is the lawsuit costing us?" Barbara hesitated. "Legal fees are being paid out of the reserve fund. We have budgeted $50,000 for this matter." There was a murmur in the room. $50,000 was clearly a lot of money for this community. A man stood up. "Barbara, with all due respect, multiple people have asked to see the actual lease agreement and the documentation supporting it. Can you share that with us? We deserve to know what we are fighting." "That is sensitive legal information that we cannot disclose during active litigation," Barbara said quickly. "That is not true," another woman said. "I talked to a lawyer friend of mine, and she said HOA members have a right to review documents related to how their fees are being spent. If we are funding this lawsuit, we should be able to see the evidence." Barbara's face was turning red. "This is not the appropriate forum for this discussion. If you have concerns, you can email the board." I almost felt bad for her. Almost. It was clear that not everyone in the community was on board with the lawsuit, and Barbara was trying to maintain control of a situation that was slipping away from her. The meeting ended shortly after, with Barbara shutting down any further discussion of the legal matter. As people filed out, several of them glanced at me curiously, but no one approached me except Monica, the woman who had stopped me on the street months ago. "That was brave showing up here," she said quietly. "I wanted to understand what I am dealing with." Barbara is in over her head, but she will never admit it. She convinced the board to file the lawsuit without really consulting the broader community. A lot of people are angry about it. "Angry enough to do something about it," Monica shrugged. "Maybe. There is talk of trying to recall the board, but that takes organizing and effort, and most people are too busy with their own lives. It is easier to just complain." Over the next few months, the lawsuit proceeded slowly. There were motions and counter-motions, discovery requests, depositions. Sandra handled everything expertly, and she reported regularly that things were going well. The HOA's attorneys could not produce any real evidence to support their claims, and their arguments were falling apart under scrutiny. In November, Sandra called me with news. "The HOA's attorney has reached out about settlement discussions," she said. "I think they are realizing they cannot win. What kind of settlement are they proposing? They want to reduce the monthly rent to $10,000 and eliminate the inflation adjustment." I did not even have to think about it. "No, the current terms are fair, and I am not rewarding them for filing a frivolous lawsuit." "I thought you would say that. I will let them know we are not interested." In December, the judge issued a summary judgment ruling in my favor. The decision was comprehensive and left no room for doubt. The judge found that the lease agreement was valid, that Uncle Theodore had acted properly and legally, and that the HOA had failed to produce any evidence to support their claims. The judge also ordered the HOA to pay my legal fees, which had amounted to about $30,000. I should have felt triumphant, but mostly I felt tired. The whole ordeal had been exhausting, and I knew it was not really over. The HOA could appeal, though Sandra thought it was unlikely they would succeed. I drove up to Dalton a few days after the ruling to spend some time at the cabin. It was a cold December afternoon, and the property looked beautiful covered in a light frost. I was inside making coffee when I heard someone knocking on the door. It was Barbara, but she looked different than the last time I had seen her. She was not dressed in her usual aggressive suburban armor. She wore jeans and a plain jacket, and she looked exhausted. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice lacking its usual edge. I let her in. We sat in the living room, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. "I am not here as the HOA president," Barbara finally said. "I am here as someone who made a mistake and needs to acknowledge it." That surprised me. "Okay." "I was wrong. About the lawsuit, about the way I treated you, about all of it. I let my pride and my anger at the situation cloud my judgment. I convinced myself that we were being victimized, and I turned you into the villain in my head. But the truth is, your uncle was within his rights, and so are you." I did not know what to say. This was not the Barbara I had been dealing with for months. "The lawsuit cost our community a lot of money we did not have," she continued. "Money that came out of reserves we needed for real maintenance and improvements. And now we owe you another $30,000 in legal fees. People are furious with me. There is going to be a recall vote in January, and I am going to lose. I am sorry that happened. Do not be. I brought it on myself." She looked at me directly. "I am here to ask if there is any way to make this right. Not to renegotiate the lease. I understand that is not on the table. But is there anything I can do to help repair the relationship between you and the community?" I thought about it. "I do not want to be the enemy here, Barbara. I never did. I just want what is fair. If the community can accept that the lease is legitimate and stop fighting it, I am happy to be a reasonable landlord. If there are issues with the property, with maintenance or access or anything else, I am willing to work with the HOA on that. But I am not going to be bullied or threatened." Barbara nodded. "That is fair. I will do what I can to change the tone, though I do not know how much influence I will have after January." She left shortly after, and I was left wondering if this was really the end of the conflict or just another chapter. The recall vote happened in January, as Barbara predicted. She and 2 other board members were removed and replaced by homeowners who campaigned on a platform of practical management and community cooperation. The new board president was a man named David Chang, a software engineer in his 40s who seemed level-headed and pragmatic. David reached out to me in February, asking if we could meet to discuss the relationship between me and the HOA going forward. We met at a coffee shop in Dalton, neutral ground. "I want to start fresh," David said after we had ordered. "The previous board made a lot of mistakes, and I think we can do better. The community understands now that the lease is legitimate and binding. What we want is just to have a functional working relationship with you as our landlord." "I am completely open to that," I said. "What did you have in mind?" We spent the next hour discussing practical matters. The HOA wanted clarification on maintenance responsibilities, on whether they could make improvements to common areas without getting my approval each time, on how to handle situations where utilities or infrastructure needed access across parts of the property outside the subdivision boundaries. These were all reasonable questions, and we were able to work through most of them on the spot. "There is one other thing," David said as we were wrapping up. "A few homeowners have expressed interest in buying the land under the subdivision outright, rather than continuing to lease. Would you ever consider selling just that portion of the property?" I had actually thought about this. "Possibly, but it would have to be at fair market value, and I would want the sale to be to the HOA as an entity, not to individual homeowners. That way the ownership stays with the community." "What would fair market value look like?" "I would need to get it appraised, but based on my research, probably somewhere in the range of $2 to $3 million. David winced. "That is a lot of money for a community our size." "I know. Which is why the lease might actually be the better arrangement for everyone." But if the community wants to explore purchasing, I am willing to have that conversation with real numbers on the table. We parted on good terms, and I felt cautiously optimistic for the first time in months. Spring came, and with it, a sense of normalcy. The rent payments continued like clockwork. I visited the property regularly, started making some improvements to the cabin, and even began to appreciate Uncle Theodore's love for the land. I understood now why he had fought to keep it. In April, I received an unexpected visitor at the cabin. It was an older man, probably in his 70s, wearing work clothes and driving a beat-up pickup truck. "You must be Theodore's nephew," he said when I opened the door. "I am Walter Simmons. I was the fellow your uncle hired to look after the place." I recognized the name from Uncle Theodore's records. "Xavier Garrison. Nice to meet you." "Your uncle was a good man," Walter said. "Fair, honest, did not ask for anything unreasonable. I just wanted to come by and introduce myself, see if you needed anyone to keep doing what I was doing." "What exactly were you doing?" "Checking the property every few weeks, making sure there was no damage, no trespassers, that sort of thing. Keeping an eye on the cabin, doing minor repairs." "Your uncle paid me $200 a month, which was more than fair for the work." I liked Walter immediately. He had an easy, straightforward manner that reminded me of my grandfather. "I would definitely like to keep you on. The property management company I hired is fine for the cabin, but I could use someone who really knows the land." "I know every acre of it," Walter said with a hint of pride. "Walked most of it with Theodore over the years." We talked for a while, and Walter shared stories about Uncle Theodore. He painted a picture of a man who was quiet but observant, generous but not a pushover, someone who had loved the land deeply and wanted to protect it. "He was not trying to stick it to anyone with that lease," Walter said. "He just did not want to be cheated out of what was his. And he knew if he forced them to tear down the subdivision, all those families would suffer for something that was not their fault. So he found a way to make it work. That is the kind of man he was." After Walter left, I sat on the porch and looked out over the property. I realized I had been thinking about all of this wrong. I had been so focused on the conflict with the HOA, on defending my rights and not being pushed around, that I had lost sight of what Uncle Theodore had actually done. He had not just protected his property. He had found a solution that allowed everyone to move forward. That evening, I called David Chang. "I have been thinking about our conversation about the community potentially buying the land," I said. "I want to make you a different proposal. I am listening. What if we set up a lease-to-own arrangement? The HOA continues paying the current rent, but a portion of each payment goes toward a purchase price. We would agree on a total price now, something fair but manageable, and over time the community would build equity until they owned the land outright." There was silence on the other end of the line. "That is actually brilliant. Let me run some numbers and talk to the board, but I think this could work." Over the next few months, we negotiated the details. We agreed on a purchase price of $2.4 million, which would be paid over 20 years through the existing monthly rent structure. The HOA would get credit for the rent they had already paid since Uncle Theodore's death, about $140,000. Once the property was paid off, the HOA would own the land under the subdivision outright. The proposal was put to a vote of the HOA membership in July, and it passed with over 80% approval. People were relieved to have a path toward ownership, and the fact that it did not require any increase in their current fees made it palatable. I had Sandra Chen draw up the agreement, making sure everything was legally sound. In August, at a community meeting I attended as a guest, David and I signed the new lease-to-own contract in front of the entire HOA membership. "This is a good day for Meadowbrook Estates," David said in a short speech afterward. We have gone from conflict to cooperation, and we have a clear path forward. I want to thank Xavier Garrison for being willing to work with us to find a solution that benefits everyone. There was applause, genuine and warm. Several people came up to me afterward to shake my hand and thank me. Monica, who had been one of the first to reach out to me with support, gave me a hug. You could have held this over us forever, she said. Thank you for being reasonable. Barbara was there too, no longer on the board but still a member of the community. She approached me somewhat hesitantly. I owe you an apology, she said. A real one, not just the one I gave you before. I made your life difficult because I could not accept that sometimes things do not go the way you want them to, even when you feel justified in your anger. You have been more gracious than I had any right to expect. We all make mistakes, I said. What matters is how we handle them afterward. The arrangement worked smoothly from there. The monthly payments continued. The HOA took ownership of maintaining the subdivision and common areas, and I retained ownership of the rest of the 600 acres. I kept the cabin and visited regularly, sometimes spending entire weekends there hiking, reading, and enjoying the solitude. In September, I quit my engineering job. The passive income from the lease-to-own payments was more than enough to live on, and I wanted to do something different with my life. I started taking classes in environmental science and land management, thinking about what I wanted to do with the rest of the property. Walter and I became friends. He taught me about the land, showed me the best spots to see wildlife, explained the history of the area. He had grown up in Whitfield County and remembered when all of this was farmland before it gradually turned to forest. Your uncle had offers over the years to develop more of it, Walter told me one afternoon as we walked along the creek that ran through the eastern part of the property. Developers wanted to buy pieces, logging companies wanted to cut the trees. He always said no. He wanted to keep it like this. I am starting to understand why, I said, looking at the clear water running over smooth stones, surrounded by dense forest. By the end of the year, I had made a decision. I would keep the land exactly as it was, undeveloped and protected. I consulted with a land trust organization about potentially putting most of it into a conservation easement, which would prevent future development while still allowing me to own and use the property. It would also provide some tax benefits that would offset the property taxes. In December, almost 2 years after that first phone call from Pemberton telling me about the inheritance, I sat on the porch of the cabin watching the sun set over the hills. The air was cold and crisp, and I could see my breath. Somewhere in the distance, I heard a dog barking, probably from one of the houses in Meadowbrook Estates. I thought about Uncle Theodore, about the life he had lived here, about the decision he had made when he discovered the subdivision on his land. He could have chosen anger and confrontation. Instead, he had chosen a solution that protected his rights while allowing others to keep their homes. And in doing so, he had set an example that I was trying to follow. My phone buzzed with a notification. The monthly payment had come through, right on schedule. $20,000, part of which was now going toward the HOA eventually owning the land under their homes. It was a good arrangement, fair to everyone involved. I finished my coffee and went inside to start a fire in the fireplace. Tomorrow I would drive back to Atlanta, but tonight I would stay here, in the cabin on the property that had changed my life in ways I never could have anticipated. The story could have ended badly. It could have been years of bitter litigation, a community torn apart by resentment, relationships destroyed by stubbornness on all sides. But it did not end that way because people on both sides chose to be reasonable, to look for solutions instead of just fighting over positions. I had inherited 600 acres and found that an HOA had built their subdivision on it. Now they were paying me rent, and eventually they would own that piece of land themselves. Everyone got what they needed, and no one had to be destroyed in the process. As I sat by the fire that night, I realized Uncle Theodore had given me more than just land and money. He had given me an example of how to navigate conflict with integrity, how to stand up for what is right without being cruel, how to find solutions that honor everyone's legitimate interests. The flames crackled and popped, and outside the wind moved through the trees. I was home, in a place I had never expected to find, doing something I never expected to do. Life had a funny way of working out sometimes. In the years that followed, I would become a proper steward of the land, working with environmental organizations, hosting school groups for educational programs about forest ecology, and slowly building trails and observation points for responsible recreation. The property would become something valuable not just to me, but to the broader community. Meadowbrook Estates would continue to thrive as a neighborhood, and my relationship with the HOA would evolve into something genuinely collaborative. When the subdivision wanted to add a community garden, I leased them an additional quarter-acre at a nominal rate. When they needed to expand their stormwater management system, I worked with them to design something that benefited both the neighborhood and the surrounding ecosystem. David Chang and I became friends, grabbing lunch regularly to discuss not just the business arrangement between us but life in general. He introduced me to other people in the area, and I gradually became part of the community rather than an outsider. Barbara Whitmore and I never became close, but we reached a mutual respect. She eventually moved away from Meadowbrook Estates, selling her house and relocating to Florida to be near her daughter. Before she left, she stopped by the cabin one last time. "I learned a lot from this whole experience," she said. "About not letting pride drive your decisions, about knowing when to admit you are wrong. I am not sure I ever properly thanked you for not holding grudges." "Life is too short for grudges," I said. "We are all just trying to figure things out as we go." Walter continued to work for me until he was well into his 80s, finally retiring when his knees could not handle the walking anymore. I made sure he had a comfortable retirement, setting up a small pension for him that continued the monthly payments he had been receiving. He had earned it, not just for the work but for the mentorship and friendship. The cabin became my primary residence. I renovated it gradually, expanding it slightly while keeping its character. I added a larger office where I could work on my environmental projects and a better kitchen because I discovered I enjoyed cooking. The property became my sanctuary, the place where I felt most myself. I never married, though I dated occasionally. The women I met seemed to fall into two categories. Those who thought owning 600 acres made me some kind of landed gentry and approached me with dollar signs in their eyes, and those who could not understand why I would want to live in what they saw as the middle of nowhere. I decided I was fine being single, at least for now. The land and the work I was doing with it felt like enough. On the 20th anniversary of Uncle Theodore's death, which coincided almost exactly with the final payment on the lease-to-own agreement, the Meadowbrook Estates HOA threw a celebration. It was held in the community center, but this time the atmosphere was festive rather than tense. There was food, music, and speeches. David, still the HOA president after all these years, presented me with a plaque thanking me for partnership, fairness, and vision. I was genuinely touched, even though I joked that I had just been trying not to mess up what Uncle Theodore had started. "The thing is," David said in his speech, "Xavier could have been a difficult landlord. He had all the power in this relationship. The legal agreement was entirely in his favor. But instead of exploiting that, he worked with us to find solutions that benefited everyone. That is rare, and it is worth recognizing. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it brief. My Uncle Theodore was a smart man who taught me, even after his death, that the best solutions are the ones where everyone wins. Thank you for being willing to work with me to make that happen. Congratulations on becoming full owners of your land. You have earned it. That night, after the celebration ended, I drove back to the cabin and walked out to a clearing on a hill that offered a view of the entire property. I could see the lights of Meadowbrook Estates twinkling in the distance, and beyond that, the dark expanse of the rest of the 600 acres stretching toward the mountains. I thought about the journey, about how a phone call one rainy Tuesday morning had changed everything. I thought about Barbara's threats and David's pragmatism, about Monica's quiet support and Walter's wisdom. I thought about Uncle Theodore, who I had barely known but who had shaped my life in profound ways. The inheritance had brought me money, yes, but more importantly, it had brought me purpose. It had given me something to protect, something to be responsible for, something to care about beyond my own immediate needs. It had forced me to grow up in ways I had not expected, to learn about negotiation and compromise, about standing firm and being flexible, about the difference between stubbornness and principle. As I stood there in the darkness, I felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the land and the financial security it provided, but for the lessons and the experiences, for the challenges that had made me better, for the people I had met along the way. I had inherited 600 acres and found an HOA had built their subdivision on it. They had paid me rent, and now they owned their piece of the land. But the real story was not about the money or the legal agreements. It was about how conflict can be transformed into cooperation, how seemingly incompatible interests can find common ground, how a little bit of good faith on all sides can turn a nightmare situation into something genuinely positive. I walked back to the cabin, my home, feeling satisfied in a way I had never felt in my old life in Atlanta. The engineering job, the apartment, the routine of that existence felt like it belonged to a different person. I had become someone new here on this land, someone I liked better. Inside, I poured myself a drink and sat by the fire, thinking about what would come next. There were still so many possibilities, so many things I wanted to do with the property, so many ways I could contribute to conservation and education. The lease-to-own payments had stopped now that the HOA owned their land, but I had invested wisely over the years and had enough to live comfortably. I also had income from some carefully planned sustainable forestry on portions of the property, harvesting trees selectively in ways that actually improved forest health. My life had become exactly what I never knew I wanted. I had space and freedom, purpose and community, solitude and connection. I had learned to be a landowner, not in the sense of someone who exploits property for maximum profit, but in the older sense of someone who acts as a steward, protecting and nurturing what has been entrusted to them. As I drifted off to sleep that night, I made a mental note to visit Uncle Theodore's grave the next day. I had been a few times over the years, always feeling a little awkward about it since I had barely known the man. But I wanted to tell him that I understood now, that I got what he was trying to do, that I would continue his legacy of protecting this beautiful piece of Georgia from those who would see it only as a commodity to be exploited. The next morning dawned clear and cold. I drove to the cemetery in Dalton where Uncle Theodore was buried. His grave was simple, just a flat marker with his name and dates. I stood there for a while, not really knowing what to say. Finally, I spoke aloud, feeling only slightly ridiculous. I think I finally understand what you were doing, Uncle Theodore. You were not trying to get rich or punish anyone. You were just trying to protect something you loved and find a way for everyone to live with the consequences of a mistake that was not really anyone's fault. I hope I have done right by your legacy. I am trying to take care of the land the way you did, and I am trying to treat people fairly the way you did. Thank you for the inheritance. Thank you for the example. I will keep taking care of it. A cold breeze moved through the cemetery, rustling the dried leaves on the ground. I stood there a moment longer, then walked back to my truck. Life continued its steady rhythm after that. The seasons changed, the land cycled through its annual transformations, and I settled more deeply into my role as its caretaker. The former conflict with the HOA became just a story we told, an example of how things could have gone badly but did not. I started writing about my experiences, publishing articles about land conservation and community cooperation. Some of them got picked up by environmental magazines and blogs. I gave occasional talks to land trust organizations and HOA management groups, sharing the lessons I had learned about finding common ground in property disputes. The cabin became a gathering place for friends and family who appreciated the quiet beauty of the property. My sister visited with her kids, and I taught my nephews to fish in the creek. Old friends from Atlanta came up for weekends, grateful for a place to escape the city. I hosted small gatherings of environmental activists and conservationists, using the property as a living classroom for discussions about sustainable land management. Walter passed away peacefully in his sleep at 89. I spoke at his funeral, telling stories about our walks through the property and the wisdom he had shared. His family thanked me for taking care of him in his final years, and I assured them it had been my privilege. After the funeral, I established a small scholarship in his name for local students studying environmental science or forestry. The years accumulated, each one adding depth to my understanding of the land and my place in its story. I was not the first person to care for these acres, and I would not be the last. I was just one link in a chain, doing my best to protect what had been entrusted to me and pass it on in better condition than I had received it. The experience with the HOA taught me lessons I used in other areas of my life. When conflicts arose, I tried to look for solutions that honored everyone's legitimate interests. When I had power, I tried to use it responsibly. When I was wrong, I tried to admit it quickly and make amends. These were simple principles, but they made life so much easier and more satisfying. I never became wealthy in the conventional sense, but I had enough. I never became famous, but I made a difference in my small corner of the world. I never married or had children, but I had deep friendships and meaningful work. It was a good life, one I had never planned but one that fit me perfectly. Sometimes I wondered what would have happened if Uncle Theodore had not left me the land, if I had continued on my original path as an engineer in Atlanta. I probably would have been fine, living a perfectly acceptable middle-class American life. But I would have missed this, all of it, the beauty and the challenge and the growth that came from being responsible for something larger than myself. The inheritance had been a gift, but not just of money or property. It had been a gift of possibility, of transformation, of becoming someone I had not known I could be. And for that, I would be forever grateful to a man I had barely known but who had seen something in me worth betting on. As I sit here now, writing these words on the porch of the cabin with the forest stretching out before me and the lights of Meadowbrook Estates visible in the distance, I feel a profound sense of contentment. The story that began with a surprising phone call and spiraled into conflict and confusion has resolved into something beautiful and lasting. I inherited 600 acres and found an HOA had built their subdivision on it. They paid me rent, and then they bought their land, and through it all, we learned to work together instead of against each other. It is not the most dramatic story, perhaps, but it is a true one, and it has a happy ending. In a world that often seems full of zero-sum conflicts where someone has to lose for someone else to win, that feels like something worth celebrating. The sun is setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Tomorrow I will wake up and continue the work of caring for this land, of being a good neighbor to the community that shares it with me, of trying to leave things a little better than I found them. It is simple work in many ways, but it is meaningful. And that, I have learned, is what really matters.